They say history is written by the victors. But what if victory was built on silence? On the cries that never made it past the stone walls of a prison? On the voice of a girl, just 15, who dared to say one word, no. Napoleon was not used to hearing no. Not from generals, not from nations, and especially not from her. So he did what all men drunk on power eventually do. He buried her, not in earth, but in a cell, where no one could hear the truth echo back. Power doesn't shout, not when it's real. It whispers behind velvet. It smiles in portraits. It signs letters with grace and watches as the world bends. And by the time he called himself emperor, Napoleon had mastered the art of soft brutality. He didn't just conquer kingdoms. He redrew the edges of dignity. He didn't just crush revolts. He rewrote the definition of rebellion. To disobey him, even in gesture, even in silence, was to offend not just the man, but the myth. And that is what she did. Her name was Lucille, daughter of a minor aristocrat, raised among crumbling tapestries and quiet gardens. She was born into that gray space history never talks about, the soft class, the forgotten bloodlines, not poor enough to starve, not powerful enough to matter. She was taught to curtsy before she could speak, taught that silence was survival, taught that a woman's value was measured in her obedience, her softness, her ability to be overlooked until needed. But Lucille had a flaw. She watched too closely. While the other girls practiced piano, she listened to the sound of boots in the courtyard. While her mother praised the emperor's victories, Lucille traced the patterns of his prisons. While her tutors recited patriotism, she memorized the names of the missing. And then one day he arrived. Not Napoleon himself, he never lowered himself that far, but his emissaries, his shadows, his velvet-draped voices. They came bearing letters, demands, promises. They told her father she had been noticed. Not for her beauty, not for her breeding, for her spirit. They called it refreshing, untamed, exactly what he liked. Napoleon had heard of her. A girl who read poetry in Latin, who spoke of empires as if they were brittle. A girl who, when asked what she thought of conquest, said, "If a man needs applause to feel real, he's already lost." He wanted her brought to court, not for marriage, not for position, for proximity. Because there's a kind of hunger power has, not for flesh, but for resistance. It wants to touch it, to own it, to say, even that is mine. Lucille was given the choice all women in history are given, whether whispered or screamed, obey or disappear. And she smiled, and she said no, not with rage, not with rebellion, with calm, with clarity, with the kind of refusal that frightens tyrants because it comes from a place they can't reach. They didn't drag her through the streets. They didn't break down her door. They simply came one night while the town slept and took her in silence. Her father never spoke of it again. Her mother wept once, then powdered her face and said the house was too quiet. Lucille was taken to a villa outside Paris. A beautiful prison. Marble floors, gold trim, windows too high to touch. A cell dressed like a ballroom. They told her it was for her safety. They said the emperor was disappointed, that he was giving her time to think. Time. The weapon history always underestimates. She wasn't beaten. She wasn't starved. She was forgotten. Days melted into each other like wax from an unsnuffed candle. She was given books, but censored. Letters, but none delivered. Visitors, but only the ones who lied sweetly. And yet she didn't break, because Lucille had something they couldn't see. She had learned early that silence could be a scream. That stillness could be defiance. That dignity doesn't require an audience. She refused to perform regret. She didn't pray loudly. She didn't beg. She sat by the window writing poems in dust on the stone. She spoke to the sparrows outside, gave them names. She memorized the patterns of a light across her walls. And somewhere far away the emperor forgot her, because to remember her would mean admitting there was a soul he couldn't own. She became a myth, a ghost in velvet. Some said she had been sent abroad. Others said she had joined a convent. No one said she had been locked away, because that would mean facing what the empire truly was. Not a monument of glory, but a machine that ground resistance into silence, especially when it wore a dress. Lucille did not die there, not in the way they hoped. Her body weakened, but her name, her story began to circulate in whispers. among chambermaids, gardeners, wet nurses, the ones who saw everything and were believed by no one. They spoke of the girl who said no, the girl who vanished, and in their voices she lived, not as prisoner, as warning, as reminder, that even the most golden cages cannot hold the truth forever, and that sometimes the bravest act in an empire of men is a girl who simply refuses to smile. There are prisons that scream, and there are prisons that whisper. Lucille's cell did not chain her body. It did something worse. It seduced her mind. They brought her flowers. Daily, orchids from the south and peonies from stolen lands. A gesture of grace, they said, from him. She wasn't allowed to say his name. Napoleon, the sun around which all else orbited. The general who had become emperor, and then something even more dangerous. A man who believed in his own myth. He never visited her, but he watched, through intermediaries, through letters that never signed themselves but carried the weight of absolute control. One note, left on her tray beside breakfast, read, "Freedom is given to those who learn to use it wisely." Another, "Empires cannot afford stubborn hearts. Bend, and you will live." She never replied. Instead, she made a ritual of silence. Each morning she stood by the window, too narrow for escape, but wide enough to watch the seasons change, and recited the names of every woman history had tried to forget. Hypatia, Joan, Anne, and now she added her own, Lucille. She wrote it in steam on the window glass. She whispered it to the birds. She scratched it into the underside of her bed frame with the edge of a porcelain spoon. Lucille, she would not be erased. The guards grew uneasy, not because she screamed, she never did, but because she seemed to know something. She greeted them by name, not the ones they gave her, but the names of their mothers, their sisters. She looked at them too long, like she was reading the place in them they tried to keep hidden. And then she began to paint. They had given her brushes, another illusion of kindness. They thought she'd paint flowers, angels, scenes from scripture. She painted walls, every inch of them, first with blue, then black, then silver spirals that moved like galaxies. She painted women, not weeping or pleading, but staring, straight ahead, back at whoever dared to look at them. And when they asked what it meant, she simply said, "I want him to see." The guards asked who she meant. She didn't answer, but they knew, and they began to close the door faster each time they entered, because the walls now watched them too. News traveled even in silence. A maid who served her once whispered to a friend, who told a cousin, who wrote a letter. That letter found its way to a salon in Paris where a woman drank wine and compared bruises no man believed. They read it aloud. They said her name, Lucille, a girl who refused the emperor and lived. And slowly, a new story was born. Not about conquest, not about war, but about refusal, and the price it exacts. The empire tried to stop it. They denied she existed, said she had married, moved to Corsica, and died of illness. But silence, once broken, does not reseal, especially when it echoes in the mouths of women who have been waiting for centuries to speak. They came to her villa one night, not to free her, to re-educate her. A man in gray entered the cell. He didn't bow, didn't smile. He placed a paper before her, a confession, a recantation, a surrender. She didn't read it. She lit a candle, held the flame to the page, watched it curl. And when he struck her once across the face, she did not flinch. She looked at him the way ruins look at tourists, ancient, unimpressed. She knew now what they feared. Not rebellion, not even revolution, but a girl who would rather vanish than kneel. She no longer cried. She no longer waited. She simply was. A stillness so profound it became dangerous. And in the heart of an empire obsessed with motion, progress as conquest, stillness was treason. They boarded up her windows, removed her brushes, took away the cat who visited her each dusk. But they were too late. She had already built a world inside her the emperor could not reach. A world where girls who say no do not disappear. They become the silence that haunts every throne. And Lucille? She smiled, because she had realized something. Even in the deepest cell, watched by the cruelest men, she was still the only one who could decide what her name meant. Napoleon never said her name in public. It was beneath him, he claimed. This provincial girl who had disrespected an imperial invitation, a minor insult, an irrelevant flicker in the vast flame of his destiny. But in private he asked about her. Where is she now? Has she changed her mind? Is she eating? What does she write on the walls? And when his aides hesitated to answer, he grew cold. Because a man who has conquered cities, rewritten constitutions, and declared himself an emperor cannot bear the weight of a girl who will not bow. Lucille had become something he could not campaign against. Not an enemy, not a rival, a question. And empires, true empires, do not survive unanswered questions. So he made her a ghost. He ordered her records removed, her letters destroyed, her family threatened, her portrait, commissioned before her refusal, burned in the palace furnace. It was supposed to end her, but all it did was set the story free. The girl who said no became rumor. Rumor became myth. Myth became memory. Women whispered about her as they brushed their hair at night, as they fed their daughters, as they stitched letters into petticoats. Men heard the story and laughed until they saw the way their wives stopped smiling when they did. There were rumors that Lucille had died, that she'd thrown herself from the tower, that she'd poisoned her tea, but none of it was true. She was still there, still alive, still waiting, not for rescue, but for them to realize that she could not be undone. And the walls she had painted, those strange spirals, the women with unblinking eyes, they began to fade, not from time, but from fear. The guards covered them, whitewashed the truths. But paint, like memory, bleeds through if the surface is weak. And they were weak, because by now they had seen too much. One guard refused to return to her cell. Another left Paris entirely. One, it said, stayed at her door for years and never spoke again. Not out of guilt, but awe. Because what Lucille had done was not resist power. She had ignored it. And there is nothing more terrifying to the powerful than irrelevance. Napoleon continued his rise. He crowned himself. He marched east. He redrew borders like a child sketching castles in sand. But at night, in the chambers where no one dared enter without being called, he stared at maps and saw her face in the empty spaces. He read reports, but between the lines he saw poems. He looked at women and wondered if they, too, had said no to something and simply had been better at hiding it. He was haunted not by what Lucille had done, but by what she hadn't. She hadn't begged. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't tried to be remembered. She had simply lived without him, and in doing so, revealed the absurdity of his need to be worshipped. He ordered her moved to another villa, a colder one, higher in the hills, where the wind didn't speak and the stars never felt close. He thought it would break her. It didn't. She adapted. She peeled the paint from the walls, used stone to scratch symbols into the floor, wrote in ash, in steam, in thread pulled from her own skirts. She didn't need light anymore. She had memorized the rhythm of shadows, and in that rhythm she wrote stories, not of emperors, but of hands that held instead of ruled, of voices that asked instead of ordered, of lives lived with breath, not banners. The girl who said no had become a woman who didn't need to say anything at all, and when war returned to France, and bodies filled the fields like fallen wheat, and the emperor who could not be denied finally began to lose, people remembered her, not as tragedy, as prophecy. Because an empire that fears a teenage girl's refusal is not a strong empire. It is a glass crown balanced on the trembling hands. And somewhere, alone, in a villa high above the noise, Lucille smiled again, because history wasn't done with her. It had only just begun to understand what she meant. Empires die loudly, with smoke and horses and boots fleeing across broken borders, with marble cracked by cannon fire, with men tearing ribbons from their own uniforms so they won't be mistaken for what they once worshipped. But sometimes they also die quietly, with a whisper, a name, a silence they can no longer explain. Napoleon's fall was not sudden. It was slow, like the tide pulling away from a castle of sand, one defeat, then another, a mistake, then pride refusing to call it that. And all the while Lucille sat in her cell, untouched by glory or ruin. She had outlived his parades, outlived his victories, outlived the version of him that believed she could be erased. Her walls were still bare, her skin pale, but her eyes, those hadn't dimmed. Because while he had been conquering cities, she had been learning how to breathe in a world that had forgotten her. The guards changed. Young men who didn't know who she was didn't ask. They brought food, took the tray, and if they paused, if they looked too long at the woman who said nothing but seemed to know, they moved on quickly. But sometimes she spoke, not to them, to herself, or maybe to something larger. She said things like, "Power wants to be loved because it knows it isn't," or, "They keep me here because they know I left a long time ago." She began writing again, this time on leaves. She folded them, tied them with strands of her own hair, and when birds landed on her windowsill, she let them take them. No one believed her, but the birds kept coming. When Napoleon was exiled, his name was whispered in Paris with disbelief. He who had been destiny was now a problem to be solved, a relic, a weight, and people began remembering other things. They remembered the taxes, the prisons, the conscriptions, the sons who never came back, the daughters who were silenced, and in the quiet that followed the end of a myth, Lucille's name returned, in salons, in songs. A young girl sang a lullaby on a street corner. She didn't know where she had heard it, but in it a woman tells a cat that saying no is not a sin, only a beginning. A portrait was found, not the one that had been burned, another, drawn by a court artist who had once glimpsed her in a corridor and could not forget her. Eyes like smoke, mouth like memory. They hung it in a bookstore, not a gallery, and the women who saw it didn't cry. They stared, like the portrait stared back. The new government, more cautious, more clever, issued a statement. They said Lucille had been a ward of the state, protected, not punished, cared for, not confined. But they didn't release her. They couldn't, because letting her go meant admitting she had never been dangerous, only right. But Lucille didn't wait for permission. One morning a maid opened her door, and the room was empty. No trace, no note, no struggle. Only a single word, carved into the wood of the windowsill. Enough. Some said she fled the country. Others said she became a nun. A few whispered that she walked into the sea, and the sea welcomed her. But the most stubborn story, the one that refused to die, was this: that she never left, that she became wind, or story, or conscience, that every time a girl stands up when told to sit, or says no without shame, or stares power in the eye and does not blink, that's her, Lucille, the ghost they couldn't bury, the woman who taught the world that some prisons have doors. But the real escape is remembering who you are before they taught you to forget. History rarely remembers the moment power cracks. It records the battles, the treaties, the coronations and exiles, but not the breath before a tyrant's command is met with stillness, not the long pause after a question is asked, and no one kneels. Lucille's story was never meant to survive. It was too small, too inconvenient, too disobedient. But that's the kind of story that slips through cracks, that travels not through books, but through blood. She had no children, but she became mother to 1,000 refusals. In the years after Napoleon fell, France tried to cleanse itself with a reinvention. A new flag, a new constitution, a new illusion of dignity. But the old habits died slowly. Men still ruled rooms by volume. Women still disappeared by convenience. And silence still sat heavy on too many lips, until someone remembered her. It wasn't her name at first, just her shape. The idea of her, fragile but unbroken. A girl who wasn't a soldier, who didn't carry a sword, but who won a war just by staying alive without apology. Her name reappeared in journals, in the margins of banned books, etched into stone behind convents, scratched into barn doors by trembling hands. Not Lucille the prisoner, not Lucille the traitor. Simply she said no, and slowly young women stopped whispering their questions. They asked them aloud. They stopped looking down when spoken to. They looked straight ahead and dared the world to meet their gaze. And that was when the world changed. Not with revolutions, with stares. A queen in another country refused to annul a marriage to appease a council. A seamstress reported a duke for cruelty, and was believed. A young girl accused of blasphemy stood trial and defended herself without weeping. Each of them, when asked where they found their strength, gave the same answer. I don't know, I just felt I wasn't alone. Lucille was never given credit. No statues were raised. But if you visited the right places, those with dust in the corners and history under the floorboards, you'd find her. In a mural half-faded beneath chapel paint. In the unfinished letter of a woman who vanished before her trial. In the last poem of a philosopher who died in prison, scrawled in blood. There are no small refusals, only underestimated ones. And in Paris, decades later, a girl walked barefoot into a courtroom accused of inciting unrest. She stood at the center, no lawyer by her side. She said nothing for 5 minutes, just stood. And when asked for her defense, she said, "I owe you nothing. I have survived worse than your verdicts." The judge paled, because though he didn't know her, he had heard that sentence before. It echoed with something older, something buried, something that once sat in a high villa, silent and unbroken. Lucille had never shouted. She had whispered, but it was the kind of whisper that digs beneath palaces, waits for the cracks and pulls and slowly until the gold falls like ash. She never signed a manifesto, never led a march, never held a musket or raised a banner. And yet, when the time came to reckon with the rot beneath the thrones of Europe, her absence was the loudest voice in the room. They tried to erase her with velvet, with protocol, with time, but history does not forget women like Lucille. It buries them, yes, beneath centuries of etiquette, beneath the names of generals, beneath dusty portraits of men who thought conquest was a substitute for meaning. But then, quietly, inevitably, those women rise. Not in vengeance, in memory. Because Lucille had become something more than a girl. She was a shape in the mind, a phrase behind the tongue, the moment before the answer. No, that single word had built more freedom than 100 treaties. And it had cost her everything, or so it seemed. But that's the trick power never learns. That some lives grow in confinement. That some souls stretch when denied, like vines in darkness reaching for cracks of light. In the final years of her life, if she lived to see them, Lucille would not have recognized the world outside. The emperor's statues chipped, his decrees overwritten. The salons where her name had once been forbidden now quoted her like scripture. A painter recreated her cell by memory, down to the cracks in the floor. He left the walls blank, except for the phrase, "Truth does not need to escape, it waits for the lie to fall." A seamstress in Lyon embroidered her name into the lining of every dress she sold. A teacher in Marseille ended each lesson with a moment of silence, for the voice is still behind walls. And in Paris a small cat, black limping, was seen resting every morning on the windowsill of an old villa thought long abandoned. No one claimed it. No one fed it. But it stayed. Because even animals remember the smell of dignity. Some claim Lucille died in that villa, buried beneath stone, with no marker but the wind. Others swore she escaped, fled to the sea, and was last seen walking barefoot along the cliffs, hair wild, laughing at the sky. But the truth is simpler. Lucille became the part of every woman who hears a question, and knows the price of answering yes is her soul. Lucille became the moment a girl chooses stillness over performance. The breath before defiance. The spine that straightens without permission. And whenever a man of power enters a room and senses that the people are no longer impressed, she is there, not in revenge. In reminder that what you lock away does not vanish. It waits. And when it returns, it does not ask for acknowledgement. It becomes undeniable. Lucille never needed a throne. She never wanted a title. She left behind no heirs. Only the most dangerous legacy of all. A life lived without surrender. A story told in whispers that outlived the empire that tried to silence her. And a single word, still trembling at the edge of every crown. No,